I'd like to give you a bit of an analysis now of digging from James Heaney's Death of a Naturalist in 1966. Key points to keep in mind are that this is the first poem in Death of a Naturalist, and it's seen as Heaney's statement of intent. And as a pastoral, it celebrates rural life and it reveals the inner tension of the poet following in the footsteps of his father and grandfather. For Heaney, this poem was particularly important. He'd regarded it as the first place where he'd done more than make an arrangement of words, and that he felt that he had let a shaft down into real life. So these questions here are some generic questions which we can use in pretty much any poetic analysis. And I've highlighted here the ones that I think really scream out with this particular poem, such as who is the speaker, what's the situation, what's the tone, and questions of form, as well as sound as an important active element of the poem. Does the poem have its own vernacular? Does the poem use imagery to achieve a particular effect? And if the poem is an answer, what is the question? These are some useful questions that we can use to guide our reading of the poem. So let's begin with the title. Is this about digging to find some form of treasure? Turning over soil for planting or harvesting? Is it about digging up the past, or is it digging for truth? And let's consider then the persona. The poem is written from a poet's perspective, and the poet is writing in his room, which is upstairs and overlooks the garden. His attention is caught by the sounds of his father digging, and his mind is cast back to his childhood memories of his father and grandfather, which are memories of awe and admiration. The persona recognizes that he's not a digger in the same vein as his forebears. Rather, he regards his pen as a metaphorical spade. Now, the poem is written in 8 stanzas of uneven length. I'd just like to pause for a moment, because in a few seconds there'll be a video that I've included in this presentation where I suggest that the poem has 9 stanzas. And that's because in that video you'll see that I've used a digital version of the poem, which splits up one stanza instead of having it as a complete stanza. You'll see what I mean when you see it. The poem begins and ends with the line, between my finger and my thumb, the squat pen rests. Yet there's a change. At the start of the poem, it says the squat pen rests, snug as a gun. At the end, it has the squat pen rests. I'll dig with it. The shift here is significant because at the end it becomes a statement of purpose, a statement of intent for what Heaney will do with his pen, what he will do with his poetry. He will dig, he will explore, he'll dig for truth, he'll dig into the past. The structure within the poem has shifts between stanzas that represent different memories of the speaker. Each image seems to dig deeper into his memory. And strong imagery is produced through onomatopoeia and alliteration. We see it with the clean rasping sound when the spade sinks into gravelly ground. We see how the father roots out tall tops, and there's the squelch and slap of soggy peat, the curt cuts of an edge. The important part, particularly with the sound imagery, is that they're often connected with the work of the father and grandfather, that these sounds suggest a precision and expertise to their work. Whether they're digging potatoes or cutting turf, this is work where there is excellence and, as I said, expertise to it, that the speaker, that Heaney finds himself in awe of. And this heightens a sense of tension that he has, the sense of regret and longing that he has, that he can't follow in their footsteps. So I'd like to now just give a little bit of a closer discussion with a bit more of an analysis on the specific language of the poem. I'm going to give you a bit of an analysis of digging as quickly as I can. This isn't a completely thorough one. A further analysis can be done in class. But I want to begin by looking at the title and the ambiguities and the multiple meanings around the title. We can look at the title as in terms of digging as a farming activity, digging for treasure. We've got the turf cutting as a form of digging. Then we have digging into the past and digging for truth. All these multiple ideas around this single word here are laid in with this poem. And so if we have a look now at the overall structure of the poem, we see it as having 9, and and it's written in free verse. Now, in saying that it's written in free verse, it still does have some rhythm about it, and it does have the occasional rhyme that we see, particularly in the second stanza, where we have the rhyming of ground and sound, and even I look down there as having some rhyme there. But overall, the poem is in a free verse. A lot of students make a bit of an error when they look at the opening lines here. I say it's an error because it's slightly problematic, and I'm referring to these lines: between my finger and my thumb, the squat pen rests snug as a gun. A lot of students jump at the word gun and make all sorts of connections to the Irish Troubles and the IRA and so forth. And a lot of the time their readings, they have some merit to them, except they overlook that the poem's written in 1964 and published in 1966 in Death of a Naturalist. And the Irish Troubles, I mean, the tensions in Ireland were certainly there, but the violence didn't really kick off until a few years later. And then when we consider what Heaney himself has said about these lines, um, he's suggested in this interview with Dennis O'Driscoll that the snug as a gun image was an image that came out of the sounds of the words. He says here, it's the connection between the sounds in thumb and snug and gun that are at the heart of the poetic matter, rather than its sociological or literary formation. So that just basically says that the poet used this piece of language because of the sound qualities of snug as a gun, rather than necessarily the symbolic value of gun, which a lot of students jump at. And another thing to remember, this is Heaney's first serious poem. This poem meant a lot to him because it was a poem that gave him the idea that he could be a poet, a professional poet. And it's the first poem in Death of a Naturalist. So this poem here is considered a statement of intent, but it's also an early work of Heaney, which means that this image here, snug as a gun, isn't as perhaps well formed as what would come much later. What we see in our stanzas with this particular poem is a shift in focus with each stanza. I kind of think of it almost as a shifting of a camera lens. But we move here to under my window a clean rasping sound with the spade sinks into gravelly ground. My father digging. What you see here in Heaney's craft is a couple of things all in one here. You have the clear sound imagery here through the onomatopoeia and the alliteration of spade sinks into gravelly ground. And then you have the use of caesura, the use of punctuation mid-line to create these pauses in here. So this is a poem that really does create some gaps and silences in our reading, but also does evoke the sounds of the rural life in Ireland, which is what Heaney is most credited for. And our next shift that we see is really a shift in time. We see this image of his father, but then comes up 20 years away, stooping in rhythm through potato drills. This idea of rhythm here describes at once the rhythm of the father's digging, but some kind of longer rhythm, a generational rhythm. And then we have our focus drawn even closer in now, down to the boot level. And again we have Heaney's use of sound imagery, but also the words here are quite abrupt. The boot nestled on the lug, the shaft against the inside knee was levered firmly. The language here is really really simple. Heaney's drawn to Anglo-Saxon words and with their abrupt sounds to describe this abrupt activity. And then we have this key shift here in the middle of the poem, which signifies a shift in time. By God, the old man could handle a spade, just like his old man. And that signals the shift to the next stanza. And so what we see in this stanza is the generational shift from the father to his grandfather. And what's really important here is the admiration that we see from our speaker, which we can see is most likely Heaney himself. the admiration for his father and grandfather. My grandfather cut more turf in a day than any other man on Turner's Bog. Once I carried him milk in a bottle corked sloppily with paper. He looks at his grandfather with this tremendous sense of awe, and his own father, and this is carried on further down here when we have these key lines. But I've no spade to follow men like them. And this is where the central tension of the poem lies, is the tension of the speaker to continue the work of his father and grandfather, and his longing to do that, and the tension he has that he isn't a farmer, he isn't a rural worker, he's part of this modern tradition now. He's a writer, a professional writer at that. And so we have the speaker insisting that in the final stanza that he is going to continue. He says, between my finger and my thumb the squat pen rests, I'll dig with it. So at once we get this continuity here through his insistence that he'll use his pen to do the work of a spade. But we have this tension here with the longing or the sense of regret that he has for not being able to follow into the work with his father. And that's where we can bring our context into play here, because this poem, coming in the middle of the 1960s, is coming at a time when Ireland is really beginning to modernise. In the period when Ireland became a republic, Ireland had stagnated somewhat because the vision of Ireland had been stuck in this idyllic nationalism that was very inward-looking, very rural, which wasn't allowing it to economically progress. In the 1960s, Lamass came into power and really started to bring Ireland into the post-war boom. And so then we have this period where the rural work is starting to give way here, and the modern world is starting to take over. And this poem really does bring that idea into sharp focus. And that's where you can couple this poem with other poems in Heaney's work, like Thatcher, or even The Forge, that kind of looks at that certain regret, because these poems are built on that pastoral tradition of exalting the rural work. But with Heaney, there's always a bit of each way. He's holding up the nobility of rural work and exalting the rural life, but there's always something at the flip side to that. And many times it's about the disappearance of that, about how it's giving way to the modern world. And we certainly see this in this poem. And so this is a poem which really does signify the intent of Heaney. It says that what his work is, he is a digger with his pen. And then when we look further on into Bogland or even Personal Helicon, we really see that that's his mission as a poet. And so we can bring his mission as a poet into his powerful use of imagery here to evoke the common rural life of Ireland, and also to signal that regret of the loss of that rural Ireland as Ireland itself modernises. So I hope that helps you out a bit here in trying to come to terms with this poem and be able to produce some really interesting responses to it. Good luck.
So in conclusion, digging is Heaney's statement of intent. The tension between the idyllic rural life and its loss in light of modernisation resonates quite loudly and would reappear in his later work. We can see this tension again in Personal Helicon, but we can also see that tension in other poems such as The Forge and Thatcher. We see in this poem a need for familial and communal continuity, and Heaney attempts to replace the spade with the pen. For him, that is how he continues the work of his father and grandfather, and is a powerful evocation of the rural Irish world through language using strong sound imagery. So I hope this short video here is helpful in giving you a better understanding of the poem and giving you some ideas that you can take away and build into your own writing on the poem, and indeed increase your enjoyment of Heaney's work, which is what this is all about. Good luck.